Hi, welcome to our sixth and final webinar in the Photographic Process Identification series. This series is funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. My name is Alice Carver-Cubic. This webinar is being recorded and will be available online. In the previous 5 webinars, we have discussed photographic materials, processes, and technologies from 1839 to the present. We've also presented a method for simplifying photographic process identification. Today, we will discuss the importance of process identification, particularly as it pertains to collection preservation and access. I'm going to focus this talk on collecting institutions. However, if you're a private collector or a photographer or just generally interested in photography, this information should be valuable to you as well. In public collecting institutions like museums, libraries, and archives, the collection is central to all of the institution's activities. Furthermore, it is central to the existence of the institution itself. We are challenged to maintain a delicate balance between collection preservation and providing access to our collections. Here's another way to look at this balance and how preservation, access, and intellectual control are all interrelated. Process identification is a major factor in achieving this balance. As we have learned, photographs are made from many different materials. While there are some general rules of thumb for collection preservation, such as providing a proper environment and housing materials, some photographic processes require special consideration. By preserving the objects, they will be available in the future, allowing us to continue to provide access and to think about how the objects fit in social, cultural, and art historical contexts. There's a lot of overlap between intellectual control and access. Having good institutional records, like cataloging records, is one aspect of intellectual control. By having good records, we can provide access to the collection and make them available for research, publications, exhibitions, and educational programs. Understanding the materials and process of a photograph is essential to interpreting and contextualizing the object. In turn, accurate identification in the institutional record also provides important information about the object for preservation and conservation treatment. I'd like to break down each of these categories and discuss them. So, we'll talk about environmental parameters, including special considerations, as well as how to measure and monitor environment. Environment is paramount to preservation, so we will spend a lot of time on this. Then, we'll address what good records means specifically as it pertains to process or medium. Finally, we'll talk about how an understanding of the technical history of photography and photographic materials will benefit research and education. Before we talk about preservation, it's good to quickly review the general types and causes of photograph deterioration in order to remind us why preservation and environment are important. Many of you already know this, but a refresher is always really nice. So there's 3 types of decay: chemical, mechanical, and biological. The major causes, of course, are light, heat, relative humidity, and environmental pollutants. When it comes to light, your storage facility should be dark when it's unoccupied. Light is only really of concern during display. In this case, you want to limit the length of time on display. You also want to eliminate all ultraviolet light, either through the choice of light source or using ultraviolet filters on your glazing, in your framing, or UV filters like on windows and things like that. Light intensity is usually measured in lumen or lux. A lumen is 1 light unit and a lux is 1 lumen per square meter. Sometimes foot candles are also used. Lux hours refers only to visible light. It is the intensity times the length of exposure. So light-sensitive objects should not have more than 50,000 lux hours per year. An object exposed to 50 lux for 4 months will have the same amount of damage as if it were exposed to twice the intensity for half that time, so like 100 lux for 2 months. Light damage is, of course, cumulative. Allowing photographs to, quote, rest in the dark storage just prolongs the life of the image before we see any damage induced by light. So there you go. What I really want to focus on is temperature, relative humidity, and of course dew point. As we shall see, these factors are all interrelated, and we need to consider them together. But first, I want to discuss each factor and kind of define each factor, and then we'll talk about how they relate to one another. So let's start with temperature. High temperatures leads to chemical decay. And that's because heat is a form of energy. In order for chemical reactions to proceed, they need energy to be pushed forward. The rate of decay doubles with every 9 degrees Fahrenheit increase in temperature. So the image that's shown here, this one here, is really illustrating the ideal gas law, showing the correlation between heat and pressure. As heat increases, kinetic energy of the atoms increases, thus increasing pressure. However, the rate of chemical reactions that leads to deterioration in photographs follows a really similar model. As heat increases, the reaction goes faster. With that said, chemical decay is actually a really slow process. A short period of high temperatures isn't going to do a whole lot of damage for most objects. It's the sustained periods of high temperature that are harmful to photographs as well as your other collection materials. Relative humidity is a measure of the amount of water in the air compared with the maximum amount that can be in the air at that temperature. So in short, it represents how saturated the air is with water vapor. Temperature and relative humidity are related. Warmer air can hold more water. So in this illustration, we show a constant amount of water at different temperatures, which results in different relative humidities. So here on the far left at 55 degrees Fahrenheit, we have 100% relative humidity. The same amount of water at 80 degrees Fahrenheit results in only 42% relative humidity. So it's a ratio of temperature to water vapor, which is then expressed as a percentage. So water is the culprit for many forms of deterioration. Much of our collections are composed of hygroscopic materials. These are materials that readily absorb and desorb water, things like paper, parchment, leather, cloth, and photographic gelatin. Extreme changes in moisture content cause collection materials to expand and contract, potentially causing permanent physical deformation. This is especially true with composite objects. So a photograph, like you might have a paper support and gelatin, the paper and the gelatin absorb different amounts of moisture at different rates. And that's where we get things like cockling. High temperature in an acidic environment catalyzes hydrolysis. This is a chemical reaction that's the major cause of deterioration in organic materials. Hydrolysis is a chemical reaction that includes water, so it's with water, and it results in the formation of like one or new substances. So if the relative humidity is elevated, that means that there's just more water available for this reaction to happen. The reaction is accelerated in the presence of acid, and the acid can come from anywhere. It can come from lignin within the paper itself. It can come from poor quality housing materials. It can come from general air pollution, which is just sort of in the air. Acid hydrolysis is a major concern for cellulosic material like paper, and it's also a major concern for some plastics. Moisture is also a major factor in biological decay. Mold will grow above 65% relative humidity. Active mold should be taken very, very seriously. It could be detrimental to your collection, but it could also be detrimental to your personal health. I would be remiss if I didn't mention dew point. Sometimes it's called dew point temperature. Dew point is a measure of the absolute amount of water in the air. It is also the temperature at which air cannot hold all the moisture in it and it condenses. In your storage facility, outdoor dew point and indoor dew point are going to be the same unless the inside air is being humidified or dehumidified. Dew point determines the temperature and relative humidity combination you can achieve. We'll go into more detail about that later. But first I want to explain this cartoon here. As the air cools, it becomes more saturated with water until it condenses out of the air. So up at the top, the temperature on the far left says it's 53 degrees. Dew point temperature is 51. As the temperature drops, we're approaching the dew point temperature. When the temperature of the air matches the dew point temperature, look what happens. Moisture condenses out of the air. Whee! So I know dew point seems really confusing, but you actually experience dew point all the time. Think about this. On a really hot, humid day, like we happen to have here in Western New York, when you take a cool bottle of soda out of the refrigerator, Water condenses on the bottle. We've all experienced this. This is dew point. The bottle and the contents of the bottle are cooler than the air. As the temperature of the bottle warms, it crosses the dew point, right? It crosses that temperature in which the water condenses out of the air and onto the bottle. You also experience this, we get steam in the shower. One time I was hiking in a state park, and I went into one of the facilities that was cinder block, and it was much cooler inside than outside in a hot day, and there was moisture on the walls because the air had actually crossed dew point because of the difference in temperature from outside and the inside wasn't being dehumidified. So let's talk about environment and temperature and humidity, and kind of what temperature and humidity ranges that we're shooting for. You may have noticed that recommendations from different sources don't always agree in terms of what your temperature and humidity limits are. So whether it's ASHRAE, ISO standards, the British Standards Institute, IPI's recommendations, or other institutions, the numbers don't always match. So here I'm going to discuss the ideas behind the recommendations for environments, because it's the ideas behind it that really matter. And once you understand those, you'll understand better what your environmental parameters are and what they should be. Most cultural heritage research centers and standards agree that 70 degrees Fahrenheit and 50% relative humidity is not a great environment. I repeat, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 50% relative humidity is not that great for your collection. So this approach is problematic for several reasons. The first, and probably the most important reason, is that 70 degrees Fahrenheit is far too warm for your collections. 70 degrees is the temperature at which hydrolysis begins. Remember, hydrolysis is that chemical reaction. It's that primary form of deterioration for paper, cloth, some plastics, and other organic materials. Below 70 degrees Fahrenheit, it's hard for hydrolysis to actually get that kickstart to start moving forward. Furthermore, maintaining these constant and static environment, it consumes an incredible amount of energy. In non-temperate climates, your HVAC systems are constantly fighting the outdoor highs and lows in both temperature and relative humidity. So your HVAC system, it's actually not really designed to do this. And so because of that massive amount of energy consumption, we end up with huge energy bills as well as a huge carbon footprint. So what is the proper storage for collections? Again, temperature and relative humidity and dew point are all interrelated, and we need to consider all these things together. But we have to start somewhere. So let's start and talk about temperature. The general rule of thumb is keep it cool. Again, different sources on storage environment don't always agree, but that's totally okay. What is really important is that you understand the general principles and not get hung up on specifics like exactly what temperature range is cool versus cold versus frozen. We can think of it as a continuum. The principles are, first, temperature in combination with relative humidity governs chemical decay. Remember that kinetic slide? So cooler is generally better. Second is to know your collection. Some photographic objects have serious inherent chemical stability issues and do best when frozen, while other materials may be actually damaged by freezing them. There are some descriptions of what materials are best suited for these sort of three safe zones that we have here, right? We have our kind of cool, cold, and frozen. We'll swing back around and we'll talk more about these sort of specific objects in detail. The third thing to notice or to keep in mind is that chemical decay is really slow, like really, really slow. So managing the extremes, right, these upper levels, is much more important than having a steady temperature year-round. So it's okay for your storage space to be a little bit cooler in the winter and warmer in the summer, sort of, depending where you live. This will save you a lot of money. So again, when we look at these three safe zones, remember that this is really continuum, right? Just the cooler, the better. We don't necessarily have to like break it apart into these chunks. Okay, so now let's look at relative humidity. With high relative humidity, you have a host of issues. Probably most importantly is mold. Really low relative humidity causes materials to lose too much water. Most photographs need a certain amount of water to maintain structural stability. And I'll actually add on to that, not just photographs, most organic materials need some water for their structural stability. If they get too dry, they get brittle. And then this can lead to permanent damage. That sweet spot, or the safe zone for relative humidity, is between 30% and 55% RH. The relative humidity can fluctuate within this safe zone. Again, you can allow your storage space to be cooler and drier in the winter, and warmer and more humid in the summer, just so long as you avoid the extremes for long periods of time, right? These extremes of below 30% or like above 55%. And now why is that? The reason is your collection doesn't actually feel short-term changes in relative humidity. So based on lab experiments and field research, we've found that it takes about a month for a book or a box of photographs to reach equilibration with the environment. That is, it takes a whole box of photographs about a month or more before it actually feels a change in relative humidity, before the amount of water in the objects matches the kind of amount of water in the air. So this is a little bit of data from a research grant that we had where we show that, okay, we have a book on a shelf, it takes a month. A box of photographs, a box of papers is about the same. Film in a can, motion picture film in a can takes 6 months. And we did this by sort of embedding data loggers into the center of objects. Okay, let me further explain this relationship between temperature, relative humidity, and dew point, and why dew point determines temperature and relative humidity combination that you can achieve. So shown here, we have 2 screenshots from the dew point calculator. That's the dpcalc.org. Notice the dew point on each is the same. On the left, the temperature is 68 degrees Fahrenheit and 40% RH. If we decrease the temperature to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, look at what goes on with the RH. Look what happens. It goes way up, way beyond our safe zone for relative humidity. Now look at this new example on the far right. The dew point is lower at 12. We can achieve cooler temperatures while staying within the safe zone for RH with a lower dew point. So hopefully now you can see this relationship and how dew point is the determining factor for your temperature and relative humidity combination. I will sort of add that sometimes we think, okay, cooler is better, so I'm going to drop my temperature. But if you're not paying attention to the dew point and the subsequent relative humidity, you're going to end up in trouble, which is what we have in this center. Another feature of the dew point calculator is you can use it to give an idea of the overall effect of temperature and relative humidity and the effect that it has on preservation quality for your collection. The site offers what we call preservation metrics. The metrics let you know when you're at risk for chemical, biological, and mechanical decay. The temperature in this example is set at 70 degrees Fahrenheit and 50% RH. That's the one on the left. On the right, we have 50 degrees Fahrenheit and 40% RH over here. So notice the difference in the preservation index between the two set points. The higher temperature over here causes a risk of chemical decay for your organic materials to accelerate, right? So now we're at risk. We have this big red sign at risk. Lowering the temperature gives us this sort of better preservation index. That's the PI there. So I'm quickly going to explain what each of these metrics means, right? So we have the PI, percent EMC, mold risk, days to mold, and so on. Okay, so the preservation index and the time-weighted preservation index are indicators for determining the preservation quality of your environment. The PI and TWPI are based on the combined influence of temperature and relative humidity on spontaneous chemical reaction in organic materials. So in short, it measures the rate of chemical decay of organic materials. Sometimes we refer to this as natural aging. The PI and TWPI values are expressed in years. So the larger the number, the better. Anything above 75 we consider pretty good. The PI and the dew point calculator gives you a snapshot of the preservation quality at that moment in time. So you're plugging in your temperature and relative humidity, and you're getting kind of a spot check, kind of a snapshot in time. The TWPI, time-weighted preservation index, integrates the temperature and relative humidity as they change over time into a single estimate of cumulative effects of the environment on the rate of decay. So the more data you collect, the better this analysis will be. This metric is part of the environmental management software, the eClimate Notebook, and I'll sort of show that quickly later. Equilibrium moisture content, percent EMC, measures the amount of moisture in the object as a result of the environment and the degree of fluctuation between periods of dampness and dryness. All of this promotes mechanical or physical damage of materials. So ideally, you want your percent EMC to be between a minimum of 5% and maximum of 12.5%. If you stay within the safe zones of temperature and relative humidity, you should be fine. You should be within this 5 to 12.5. The mold risk factor is a warning for biological decay of organic materials. It indicates the likelihood and severity of mold outbreaks in your collection, and these mold outbreaks, right, this high relative humidity also leads to increased insect activity. This metric is based on the combined influence, again, of temperature and relative humidity, but on the germination rates of common mold species and the subsequent growth of mold. This metric is fairly binary, so there's no OK rating. You're either are or are not at risk for mold. When you're at risk, the dew point calculator gives you a number of days until the possibility of mold germination. So what I want you to keep in mind is that these metrics are meant to be benchmarks. They're indicators for preservation quality. They're not meant to be absolute. For example, the mold risk factor tells you when you're at risk. You may or may not end up with a mold issue, as there's lots of other factors that sort of contribute to mold growth. So plugging in your current temperature and RH set points in the dew point calculator only gives you information for that moment. What we really recommend is continuous measuring using digital data loggers or electronic data loggers in combination with software that charts the data for you. This allows you to measure your environment over long periods of times. There's a lot of different data loggers on the market, each have pros and cons. Our general observations are that you basically get what you pay for in many cases. So really inexpensive loggers, some of them tend to break after only a few months. Loggers with a lot of bells and whistles tend to be a little bit pricey, but they can also have a lower battery life. Some less expensive loggers can't be recalibrated, so you have to throw them away, and you have to purchase new ones every 3 years or so, which is kind of wasteful. Loggers with a digital display, I like those better personally because you can visually check your environment. You can do a spot check as well, and you don't have to wait to download your data to know if you have an issue. So depending on the construction of your building, you may or may not be able to use wireless loggers. I know a lot of people are interested in wireless loggers because you don't have to manually download the data, but it really depends on your building construction. Concrete and steel frame construction, usually the wireless signal can't actually get through. So this is something to really investigate thoroughly before you purchase wireless. So each logger should have a fixed location, so don't move your loggers around. It's got its own place. They should be about 4 to 6 feet above the ground. Keep them away from direct airflow events and away from the heating and cooling and the humidity control equipment, and not adjacent to any doors and windows. That'll give you more accurate data. And finally, what do you do with all of this data? There's several software programs in the market into which you can download the data. This allows you to see how your environment is performing over time and to allow you to know if you're staying within these safe zone parameters for temperature and relative humidity, or if there's something wrong with your HVAC system. We like the ones that allow you to compare data and to resize the graphs. The data that's imaged here comes out of our eClimate Notebook software. So this is IPI software. eClimate Notebook also has the preservation metrics, which takes a lot of the guesswork out of interpreting data. It'll tell you when you're at risk for that deterioration. And so again, in this program, we have the time-weighted preservation index, which gives you that idea of rate of chemical decay over long periods of time. This is really helpful. And I know I've been to lectures that have been hosted by other organizations and institutions where the speakers have gotten up and talked about their TWPI. So there's lots and lots of software programs out there in the market. And I highly recommend that you do research for yourself and look at all of these different software programs to decide which program is actually best for you and for your institution. Okay, so I want to talk now about specifics. So let's return to this temperature chart and break down what really benefits most from frozen storage down here versus cold or cool, right? And again, it's a continuum. Think about it that way. So let's talk about it. Some photographs benefit from cold or frozen storage just due to their inherent chemical instability. With these materials, colder is better, freezing is best. The reason behind freezing relates back to that slide about temperature and kinetics. These chemical reactions are happening, right? They're inherently chemically unstable. Cold temperatures slow down the reactions significantly, and freezing them can actually halt the chemical reaction altogether in some cases, or nearly halt it anyway. So over here we have cellulose acetate and cellulose nitrate film supports, which are prone to chemical decay. Acetate film gives off that acetic acid, resulting in a strong vinegar smell. We call it vinegar syndrome. The next stage is shrinkage and channeling of the support. That's what's imaged here. Nitrate gives off a rancid smell. The smell is somewhere between vomit and the world's funkiest socks. It then becomes sticky and kind of an amber color. Super gross. In both cases, the off-gassing, right, the vinegar and the nitrate, it's actually giving off nitric acid. It's also like really bad for your health too, so you really want to be careful. And these things you definitely want to freeze. Chromogenic materials are prone to fading. This is the image in the center. So they're prone to fading of the image dyes. They're also prone to yellowing of the highlights. This is where those unreacted color couplers are. We can look at the 20th century materials and processes webinars to learn more about that. Um, this this fading occurs in the light and in dark storage. They go magenta in the dark and cyan in the light. So this is an example of fading in dark storage. While the manufacturers have improved dye stability and the coupler stability over time, all chromogenic materials will eventually look like this print here in the middle. And so that's why we freeze them, is to keep these dyes from fading and to keep the color couplers from yellowing. Freezing it just slows down the kinetics of the chemical reaction. Some inkjet papers, that's over here on the far right, they have issues with yellowing of the image receiving layer. So it's not the image that we're necessarily so concerned with, it's actually the receiving layer. Yellowing can be due to changes in the optical brightening agents. Those are those special dyes added to make papers brighter and whiter. Or it can be due to the absorption of pollutants into the receiving layer, or yellowing of the paper fibers. The causes can be heat, light exposure, the presence of environmental pollutants, with ozone being a major one. Not all inkjet papers have this issue, and it isn't really possible to know which ones will and which ones won't turn yellow. So therefore, the conservative recommendation is cold storage, cold temperatures. Many institutions don't have frozen storage, and those that do have a limited space. So it's important to maximize the use of that space and be sure that you're putting things into frozen storage that really need to be there. Frozen storage can also cause access issues because the materials need to acclimate up to 24 hours in cool storage before they can actually be brought into room temperature space like the study room. This is where that dew point comes in, right? Your photograph from frozen storage right out into your study room at room temperature is like that bottle of soda, right? It goes from being frozen to a warmer space. You're going to cross dew point and you're going to get condensation on your photograph. And you don't want that. So this is where your ID skills come in handy to knowing what should be in frozen storage. So of the color photographic processes, chromogenic materials benefit most from frozen storage because they're the only ones that fade in the dark, right? They're the only ones that are unstable in the dark. So out of these, right, your process identification skills come in handy because you can go, oh, this one's chromogenic, these aren't. I could put these in cool or cold. This one will benefit most from frozen. With that said, early silver dye bleach, those made before 1980, have a cellulose acetate support and can benefit from colder temperatures. Okay, so there's some things that we don't want to freeze. The standard suggests not freezing glass plates, but the truth is they really don't need to be frozen anyway, so it's best to save space for other things. I have run into situations where someone said, oh, well, I heard that you were supposed to freeze negatives, so I froze all of the negatives, and some of the negatives happen to be glass plates. You don't need to freeze glass plates, and there's some suggestion that it's not particularly good for them. Instant internal dye diffusion transfer prints, that's your Polaroid SX70 and your Kodak and Fuji equivalents, also should not be frozen. So again, that's another thing where your process ID comes in handy to know that these color prints, right, don't freeze. And the reason is there's lots and lots of layers in there, as well as those unreacted chemicals, right? Everything is still trapped inside of here. And things get really, really brittle when they're frozen. And so when these freeze, you actually get a lot of cracking of all of those layers. Some of them actually crack when they get frozen, so it's not so great. Okay, some other specifics. So now let's just talk about, does it matter, right? So you may remember from our past webinars that gelatin and collodion printed out prints can be difficult to distinguish from one another. So the question is, does it matter for preservation? Do you care for these objects differently? Well, the short answer is no, not really. When it comes to preservation, it doesn't really matter if it's gelatin or collodion POP. You would care for them the same. It does matter, however, if you're a conservator and you're treating the object. Gelatin is more hygroscopic. It becomes very swollen and tacky in water. Collodion completely dissolves in most solvents. So I've heard stories of people putting misidentified prints, thinking they were gelatin POP and they were actually collodion P, putting these misidentified prints into solvents and watching the image layer totally disappear, right? Binder, image, and all gone. Okay, when it comes to preservation, process identification and knowing your collection can also help you prepare for the worst, right? It can help you plan for your storage space, and it can prioritize mitigation for deterioration. For example, let's say your institution is on a floodplain. Process identification will help you determine what objects are most sensitive to water damage, things like autochromes, dye-based inkjet prints. This will help you set priorities as to where to store these objects in the event that if there was a disaster, and sort of what to prioritize. So the idea here is know your collection in advance, right? Know where to store the most sensitive objects so that if in case there were to be a disaster, those things would be best protected. Similarly, if you know that certain processes are more susceptible to deterioration, you can prioritize certain objects for a collection survey. So just some ideas there. Okay, so let's talk about housing materials, because this is another important part of preservation. Environmental pollutants can come from the air, the object itself, or poor quality housings. So you have control over the pollutants that come from the housing material. When it comes to choosing housing materials, make sure you look at the specs for the material. So oftentimes we're ordering these things online, or less common now from a catalog. Each material will have specs. Be aware of words like archival and acid-free, because they do not mean anything, right? Archival and acid-free is like saying it's green. Like, what does green even mean, right? It's all natural. Okay, what does that even mean, right? So be aware of the words like archival. What you really need to look for are, have they passed the tests outlined in ISO standard 18902? This is the standard for materials that are considered safe for photographic storage and framing. And here I've outlined all of those tests. PAT stands for photographic activity test. This test makes sure there is nothing in the material that will cause deterioration of the image or the binder. The alkaline reserve is to make sure that there's the right amount of buffering material in them. This is the calcium carbonate. The kappa test is the one that looks for lignin content, right? Make sure that they're, quote, lignin free or have a low lignin content. We're looking for a kappa number of 7 or less. pH test, make sure that the material isn't too acidic. And finally, the bleed test is for papers that have a colorant, paper materials with colorant, as well as any marking materials like pens. They shouldn't bleed. So what we have here are actually screenshots from reputable archival supply companies. And these are both for paper envelopes. So we have this big banner, pass the PAT, right? This one gives you pretty basic information, but it does tell you that it has a pH of 7.0. Okay, we're looking for between 7 and 10, perfect, right? Acid-free, lignin-free. Okay, so this is actually suggesting that we've got the kappa number of seven or less, and it's passed, again, passed that pH test, and it's passed the PAT. Excellent. This one over here is a lot wordier, so we really have to look at it and kind of pick it apart. But look, we have things like lignin content, kappa number 5 or less, exactly where we want to be, 3% calcium carbonate, pH range of 8 to 9.5, perfect, that's exactly where we want to be, nice and neutral, non-bleeding, right? Pass the photographic activity test. These are the things you want to look for. When it comes to plastics, there's good plastics and bad plastics. So some plastics, they have to have passed the photographic activity test. Some of the other, like the lignin content, right, not applicable here. But plastics that are generally considered safe for photographs are polyester, polypropylene, and polyethylene. If you have a plastic that's polyvinyl chloride, cellulose acetate, or if it's like smells like a beach ball or a shower curtain, it's gross, don't use it. Really, I would say if it smells plasticky, you should stay as far away from it as you can anyway. So there you go. What's shown here is actually polyester by the trade name Mylar usually, locking sleeve. These are great. However, when it comes to choosing the right housing for your photographs, there's some special considerations. So listed here, we have pros and cons for paper and plastic. But I want to talk a little bit about some specifics. For inkjet prints, these are susceptible to abrasion. We found that polyester interleaving and sleeves are best. With that said, polyester is prone to static, right? It's staticky. So be sure you don't get dust or debris trapped between the plastic and the print, because actually that dust or debris will abrade your print. Photographs that have a flaking binder should not be stored in plastic enclosures, again, because that static may actually grab the binder and lift it off. They should also not be stored in paper sleeves that you have to slide them in and out of, so you want to look for those 4-flap envelopes. Also, electrophotographic prints. These are best stored in paper enclosures. The reason is that pressure and heat can cause the image to actually lift and stick to plastic. So this was a pretty cursory discussion of environment and housing materials. This was like your 101. So for more in-depth information, Connecting to Collections Care has a lot of really great webinars many of them have been recorded. So here's a couple that go into more detail about some of the things we talked about. I gave one specifically about storage environments just a few months ago in December 2017. There's another one from 2012 that's about choosing data loggers given by Rachel Perkins Ehrenstein of AM Art Conservation. So Rachel has done a lot of fantastic work researching and evaluating data loggers. She's kind of an expert on the topic, so I recommend that one. And again, there's a whole bunch of other ones there too. So if you don't know that resource, go to it. IPI has lots of other resources as well. We have our filmcare.org, which is specifically about looking at film. So there's motion picture film as well as sheet film for still photography. We also have all of these storage guides that are available on our website. If you go under the resources and publications, you can find these. These are all free and available as PDFs. I want to note that the color storage guide is specifically for chromogenic materials. When we say color, we mean chromogenic. Chromogenic is the most popular and the most common color photographic process of the 20th century. So let's turn our attention to access. And the key to providing access is intellectual control and good records. So we're going to kind of bounce back and forth here. Okay, so your identification skills, as well as an understanding of photographic materials and technology, comes in handy when it comes to providing access as well as preservation. Process identification will allow you to enter correct information into the medium field and to establish good and consistent nomenclature. Having proper and consistent nomenclature in the medium field is particularly important for several reasons. In my experience, catalog records are searched in a variety of ways. One way is to search by process. And I've confirmed this with friends and other people in various jobs in the field, right? There's one major way that things are searched is by process. So it's also really common for photographic processes to have a lot of different names, and it's also common for an institutional records to have objects made for the same process cataloged by many different names. So, correct and consistent nomenclature helps researchers, educators, visitors, and your own staff have a better understanding of the object as a whole. It'll also help you better access your collection, right? Better retrieve information, that searchability. It'll also help you better care for the object. The process name, right? So what process names do we use? The process name should describe the technology and the materials in some way. So these object labels here don't do the trick. Looking at these, I don't know what the photographic process is, like, at all. Therefore, I don't know how to preserve it, I don't know how to treat it, and I really don't know how to contextualize these objects. So to emphasize this point, here's two lists of mediums I took from object labels at both museums and galleries. The list on the left are all medium line for what I think are inkjet prints. Some describe the image material, none describe the technology. Also, that troublesome word archival shows up a lot. So inkjet prints are no more or less archival than any other photographic process. There's no such thing as an archival inkjet print. On the right are all names that I found that describe chromogenic prints that were digitally exposed. So if you remember from the 20th century webinar, 20th century prints made using this process were exposed through a negative, usually with an enlarger, but in the 20th century and now in the 21st century, it's really common to expose chromogenic materials digitally from a computer file with an LED or laser system. So some of these say chromogenic in there somewhere, but many don't. Several describe the specific imaging system that was used, like Lambda or LightJet, that's that digital exposure system. C-print, Type C, and C-type are all variations on a proprietary name that specifically refers to Kodak chromogenic paper available between 1955 to about 1959. Similarly, Fuji Crystal Archive is a proprietary name for a specific Fuji product. So in the end, the process name is chromogenic, and this is what should go in your medium field. All this other information, like Lambda, Fuji Color Crystal Archive, is really important information, but that should go into other fields, like maybe the attributes field. Okay, so to sum all of this up, creating a cataloging style guide with a standardized list of process names is really important. Make sure that you use the name that describes the process and not the product. For example, chromogenic instead of C-print, silver dye bleach instead of Cibachrome. Many processes have several synonymous terms that are totally acceptable. So, for example, dicoupler print and chromogenic are synonymous, as are albumin and albumin silver print. I say just pick one term and stick with it, right? That's the point of creating the style guide. Pick one and stick with it. If you look, Gowan Weaver is a conservator, and he actually has made like a nomenclature guide. I say dicoupler print and chromogenic are synonymous, and both are fine. He has different opinions, but if you when in doubt, you can totally use his list. Pretty good. Anyway, so this will help you better retrieve information for sure. It'll help you better provide access and also give better information to your researchers. And of course, use your ID skills. Information that comes with the object, whether it's from a donor, a photographer, a dealer, or is just a box of photographs that comes from someone's house, like the information that comes with the photographs is not always correct. Photographers and donors and dealers misidentify things as well. So use your ID skills, right? Double check that the process as you're cataloging. And finally, accurate catalog records just also leads to good wall labels, good information for publications. So now let's talk about intellectual control and about the objects themselves. So I hope that you noticed that I refer to photographs as objects. Often our research and our intellectual approach to photographs is primarily focused on the image content. So while this is obviously really important, photography is, after all, a visual medium, there's a lot to be learned by considering the object as a whole. Understanding process can help us better understand the working practices of a photographer and place the object in social, cultural, art historical contexts, depending on the nature of the object. It also enhances our experience of the object by understanding how the materials contribute to the overall aesthetics of the image. For example, photographer's choice of print process and materials during a time period when there's a range of different processes often contributes a lot to our understanding and interpretation of the object. So I want you to consider this object. This is a portrait made circa 1900 using the platinum process, and it's in this nice folder here. Based on process, subject matter, and kind of this folder and presentation, I can better contextualize this object. The photographer and patron had a wide range of photographic processes available to them, but they chose platinum. Platinum prints are generally a little more expensive. They have a long tonal range. That's one of the most beautiful processes. They're only one layer structure, so they generally produce a softer image. They chose to put it in this nice presentation folder as well. All of this tells me that the sitter is probably somewhat wealthy. The portrait studio is likely a high-end portrait studio. The soft image quality tends to be preferred for portraiture as it sort of softens the features. My experience of this object has been enhanced from just another studio portrait to having a deeper appreciation for what this object is, how to contextualize it, as well as the aesthetic beauty of the object itself. So here's another example. This is an image, an object, or in 3 objects that were made by Edward Steichen in 1903. It was published in the journal Camera Work in 1906 as a photogravure. The photogravure is a process that was often used to reproduce fine art prints, particularly prints that the artist otherwise printed in platinum, gum dichromate, and gum platinum. And I'm talking like turn of the last century, right? All of these processes were really popular. The print on the far right here is a print that was removed from camera work itself. So oftentimes, camera work, you may be able to buy the whole volume, but oftentimes the volumes are actually dismantled and the prints, the photogravures, are sold separately. This particular object is on a slightly worn paper. It's on a very thin paper that's really typical of prints found in this publication. The print on the far left is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's labeled as gum bichromate over silver platinum print. It's very specific. This was likely one of Steichen's exhibition prints. And he's using multiple processes here, right? He's printing platinum or silver platinum and then printing gum bichromate on top of that to get a very specific aesthetic result here. The print in the center is a photogravure as well, but notice that it's laterally reversed and it's on a thicker paper. It's like a watercolor paper. This is the collection of the National Gallery of Art. So as far as I know, there's no written description by Steichen telling us why this object is backwards and on a different paper than the one that was published in Camera Work. But having an understanding of the photogravure process and the materials can help us to theorize a few things. So like maybe it was a test print. Maybe he accidentally made the printing plate backwards. Maybe he just wanted to see what it looked like reversed. All of this is conjecture on my part, but regardless, looking at all of these together and having an understanding of the processes allows us to have a better understanding of Steichen's use of materials and his aesthetic vision for this image, and therefore how we should experience it and interpret it. So when it comes to thinking about this relationship between process, materials, and aesthetics, how do we contextualize the object and sort of interpret the objects? There's some really great resources. Object Photo from MoMA is a fantastic website. There's also a publication that explores this topic in depth using the Thomas Walther collection. And of course, there's Graphics Atlas, right? That's the whole point of Graphics Atlas, is to explore, is to sort of use identification, but as well as the sort of idea of connoisseurship, right? This idea of how do the materials relate to the aesthetics of the object? Super important. So, finally, as we wrap up, I just want to say that, having good process identification skills makes you an asset to your institution. It makes you a better scholar, it makes you a better cataloger, but also, you can help your education department in helping them to better understand these objects. If you're in the education department, understanding the objects and having process identification skills, can help you interpret the objects to your guests. it's also, important for registrars, everyone really should have these skills, anyone who works with photographs. So with that said, thank you very much. Thank you for attending. Thank you to the National Endowment for the Humanities Division of Preservation Access for funding all of these webinars. And again, we'll always thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, which really kind of kickstarted everything by funding Graphics Atlas. Again, as always, we'll open it up to questions now. I'll give a brief survey at the end, so please do give the survey because we are always looking for feedback. This also helps us report out to the National Endowment for the Humanities so they know how wonderfully we've done and how our American tax dollars were spent. So with that, I will open it up to questions. Take off my glasses to see them. Is it possible to be too cold? We have a frost-free freezer that runs negative 30 degrees Celsius. I've been storing slides and color prints in it. Is it okay or they get brittle? That's a really good question. Things get brittle when they get cold, right? The film is definitely going to get more brittle as they get cold. I don't know if there's such thing as too cold, but think about this. There's such thing as you hit a certain point. Well, while we say colder is better, you hit a certain point where colder isn't really giving you that much more of an advantage. So really kind of at the point of freezing, that's kind of like you have a good advantage there. If you get significantly below, like at negative 30, you're not necessarily gaining much more from that, while you are using a significant amount of energy to maintain those temperatures. But again, it's the relative humidity that you really want to worry about, because there is something that's too dry. So you don't want them to get too dry, and there's also something that's too humid. As we push down the temperature, the relative humidity is going to go up. So you really want to make sure that you're not getting too much water in there. So I hope that helps. Okay, the next one is, you mentioned that you recommend interlocking vinyl sleeves. Are there advantages to using interlocking sleeves versus L sleeves for these kinds of objects? L sleeves and interlocking sleeves are the same. Maybe I even used the wrong word, but those L sleeves, right? The one that just has that bend where the one of the flaps sort of fits into that sort of bend and they lock together. Those are nice because if you tilt it sideways, like the object's not going to fly out. That's why I like those. Those tend to be a little more expensive. It's up to you, but I like the polyester because it's also clear. The other two plastics aren't as opaque, right? Or they're a little more opaque. They're not as clear. So that's why I kind of like the polyester, but it does tend to be a little thicker. So okay, the next one is, how would you deal with the preservation of photograph on unorthodox materials such as ceramics and lacquerware? Yeah, photoceramics are really common. They're not well studied because they have not been considered very precious, right? So we kind of study the things that we consider the most precious. But there's a lot of them out there, and I consider them precious, right? I think anything that we have in our collections, we have the duty to care for them. But I would say photoceramics, I'll tell you what the materials are. It's ceramics, right? So you can look to ceramics in terms of how you care for ceramics in general, but there's also a photograph. So we have this sort of weird composite object. There's a binder layer, there's the image material. Many of these that are old, like from the 19th century, the image material is actually pigment. There are a couple ways to do it, but it's actually a vitrifiable pigment. So they're pretty stable. Newer ones, there's actually like inkjet printed ones. It'd be you just have to kind of know what the materials are. But I would say, generally speaking, your kind of general storage temperature and humidity ranges should be fine for those. But those take a little bit more research, and that's something I've dug into a little bit. But in terms of photoceramics, the only commonality between them that we can be sure of is that the support is ceramic. The binder and the image material, there's like a whole bunch of different kinds of things. There's lots and lots of ways to make them. But I think your sort of like cool storage is probably fine. Okay, so the next question, I knew someone was going to ask this. So the next question is the best use buffered or unbuffered when dealing with any supplies caring for photos. And I actually have a slide kind of after my survey slide. So buffered versus non-buffered doesn't matter. There's a lot of really conflicting and confusing information out there. Depending what resource you look at, everybody tells you something different on whether you should use buffered or unbuffered, which leads to a lot of confusion. And I would say, just like when we talk about temperature and relative humidity, it's really important to know the why behind the recommendation. So, does it matter? We did some tests. So the idea of the buffered material is that the buffering agent will counteract anything acidic. So if we remember from our high school chemistry class, when you mix an acid and a base together, what do you get? You get neutral water, right? So the idea is if you have the buffering agent in the paper, if there's anything acidic in the object or in the environment, it'll become neutralized and therefore less harmful to the object. The truth is that acids are usually in the form of gas, right? When we have acids that we encounter in our collection, they're usually kind of in their gaseous state. The buffering material, calcium carbonate, is a solid that is evenly dispersed throughout the paper. That's why I have this picture of Homer Simpson here. Because my colleague Dan did some tests where we exposed buffered papers to an acidic environment and tested them. And what we found is that they were both acidic and basic at the same time. So the lazy dad is our kind of analogy, right? This Homer Simpson lazy dad is our analogy for how this works. We can think of the buffering agent, the solid, to be lazy dad. He's sitting on the couch, not moving much, and the acids are the kids running around him all crazy. If one of the acids happens to come within arm's reach of lazy dad, the lazy dad's going to grab him and yell at him and say, no, you quiet down. You have to sit here on the couch with me for 5 minutes and calm down, right? That acid has been neutralized. If an acid doesn't happen to bump into a base, into lazy dad, that acid is not neutralized at all. So there you go. The buffering materials aren't really working the way that we think that they're working. The other thing to keep in mind is that there is some suggestion that the buffering agent, the calcium carbonate, the alkaline, the fact that it's alkaline, will damage certain photographic materials. I can say that a lot of this is based on theory. It's based on ideas from what we know about how certain materials react and behave in an alkaline environment. There isn't necessarily really hard research behind it. So my recommendation is go with your gut, go with your instincts. If it's something that you think is going to be fine in a buffered environment, or in a buffered housing, and you don't think it's going to damage the object, go ahead and use buffered, but keep in mind it's not working exactly the way you think it's working. If you think that the buffering agent is harmful to the material, go with your gut, err on the side of caution, and use unbuffered. So that's the best I have for you for now. There are, I think, the National Park Service Conservogram have some information on buffered or unbuffered. That's kind of my go-to is the conservograms. I really like those. There's one on data loggers as well. I would actually, that would be kind of my default resource just to look at until we can do more research, right? We can figure this out a little bit better. Okay, next question. You spoke about using paper versus plastic for photo storage. We currently use glassine as an interleaving paper for a variety of photographs. For good and bad things about glassine, what would you recommend? The reason why we've heard bad things about glassine is because in a humid environment, the gelatin of photographs will stick to the glassine. That's kind of like the main reason why we don't use glassine. Also, if the glassine has not passed the photographic activity test, you should not be using it, or any of the other tests under that ISO standard. But when you hear about bad things about glassine, it's because of that problem that gelatin will actually stick to it. Gelatin, basically when it gets too humid, gelatin swells and it kind of becomes more like glue. Gelatin is glue, basically, or glue is made out of the same stuff gelatin is. And so that's where you end up with problems. You get what we call blocking, but basically it sticks together. I would highly recommend not using glassine. I know that there's some current products that are actually synthetic. The glassine is actually synthetic, and those have not been tested, so I really don't know. But yeah, that's my suggestion there. Okay, there's one final question. How are humidity and gamma-like rays controlled in frozen storage? I I don't know what you're talking about with gamma rays, so I'm gonna pass on that. I don't know what you mean. But humidity control, you can have frozen storage. You can have humidity controlled frozen storage. So there are temperature and relative humidity um, chambers um, where you can control both, or you can use one that is not humidity controlled, but in that case, you have to treat your objects specially. You have to wrap them in like double vapor-proof packaging to make sure that you don't get water condensation on the materials. There's a conservogram for that, and so yeah, so there's a special way that you can package things like boxes of film or cans of film in frozen storage so that you actually can control the relative humidity. Actually, you're controlling the moisture content of the materials themselves so that they don't get too moist and you don't get condensation. So there you go. Thank you. Take the survey. And again, all of these are recorded, so you can go back and watch them all. Thanks so much.